Welcome to Module 3, Common PowerApps Tasks. In this module, we want to look at some of the common tasks that you might have to do as building an application that integrates with Dynamics 365. There are a lot of things that we could have put in here. We just picked some that we thought would be helpful. Obviously, we could go on for hours with other common tasks that you might run into. What we'll do in this module is we'll talk about each of the common tasks. For some of them, go ahead and walk through a demonstration of how you can do that as part of building your application. Let's start with an easy one, but one that is frequently forgotten when building queries against Dynamics 365 data, and that's filtering on state code. Pretty much all records have an active and inactive state, and inactive state are mostly meant to be treated like deleted records, unless you have it for records that are closed, such as cases or opportunities might not be active. But you want to generally filter to give you the active records when you're doing queries. So if we were going to do a search, like I have in my example here, and just said search leads, we would get all active and inactive records qualifying for that search. What I've done is I've added a filter inside of the search on leads where state code is equal to 0. In other words, give me all the active records. Another common thing you might find yourself doing is working with dates, either to filter or to set values on records that you're updating or creating. There are 3 functions that you'll use frequently, but there are a bunch of other ones that I'll let you look at the references to figure out. Now is one of the common ones that you'll use that will return the current date and time. Today returns the current date with the time set to midnight. Date add can be used to subtract or add days, months, and years. Yes, I said date add subtracts. It can do both. You basically just provide a negative number and it will turn that into subtracting from the date rather than adding. So you could use this in combination with like today. So for example, if you subtract 7 from today, you'd effectively have the last rolling week of date ranges that you would be working with in doing a filter. Dynamics 365 stores dates in UTC, or Coordinated Universal Time is what that stands for. However, it's adjusted when it returns the data to you based on the field metadata behavior. What I mean by the metadata behavior is you can indicate whether you want the date to be returned in user local or time zone independent. And in the case of user local behavior, it's handled properly by the connector, and what you see returned to you is adjusted for your local time zone. If you're working with an entity that has a time zone independent date field, then you need to take the steps to convert that to UTC prior to sending the data to Dynamics 365. Otherwise, it won't have the proper date stored on the entity record. While there may be some scenarios where you want to behind the scenes calculate the last week date range and automatically do a query, more commonly though is to give the user the ability to interact with a control and pick the dates that they want to work with. And you might have some default dates that you want to set. So in this example, I'm using the date picker control. The date picker control, you can set the default date. You can see in this example, I want to have a range of 1 week. So what I've done is set the to date expression to be today and the default date for the from date expression to be date add today minus 7. And I specified I want to subtract 7 days from the date that I start with. Now, once you've set up your date pickers for your from and to range, if you have a filter that's populating the gallery based on some search results or including records within a specific date range, what you're going to do is go ahead and use that from date and to date to build filters on there. You can see my first attempt on this was to pass basically the created on greater than from date dot selected date. Selected date is the property on the date control that has a value of type date that was selected by the user. Now, the thing is, because I'm filtering on created on, which is of type date time value, it's not able to properly send that for processing on the server. What it's going to do is it's going to, remember how we talked in last module about how delegation works, it's going to do the query on the server, not do the date processing until it gets to the client, and then try to resolve that. I know that's happening because if you look at the created on, the greater than sign, it has the little squiggle under it. Same with the ampersand, ampersand has the blue squiggly under that. And I'd have the little blue icon with the I for information telling me that it's going to be processed on the client. So what we want to do is we want to convert this first to a date time value so it produces a query that can be delegated to the server and executed on the server. So as you can see in the bottom there, what I've done is I've actually wrapped the fromDate.selectedDate in the text function, and that allows me to pass that as a string to the datetime_value function, which then converts it to a datetime value. Then the compare is happy. It now delegates that to the server, and I get the proper results back. Now let's jump into a demo and see this in action. Another thing you might want to do with the Power App is update the entity image. For example, the contact has the image field turned on by default. Oftentimes you don't have pictures of people. What you can do is go ahead and leverage Power App's image, camera, and add picture controls to be able to interact with that. The image is used to show an existing image that has been captured. So effectively what I could do is put an image on the form, bind that to the entity image property, and it's going to show me what's currently stored as the entity image for that record. Now, if I want to allow the user to change the field, what I can do is use either the camera or the add picture control. Camera works with your device's camera, whether it's a tablet or the phone, live capture an image that can be stored. You can also use add picture, which allows you to upload a static image from your local storage. Now in the example I have here on the screen, I want to introduce a couple of concepts for you. First, what I've done is I've put a camera control on the form. I have an update button that snaps a current value of the image at the time that you click the button. Now, because I want to save a copy of that so I can use it later in the application, I'm using something new that we haven't talked about. It's called Update Context. Context is kind of like a whiteboard or a scratch piece of paper that you can store stuff on and then recall it later when you need to use it. So what I'm doing here, when you click the Update button, which is the on select event that you see on the left-hand side there, I call an Update Context function, and what I'm passing to that is I'm asking it to store in a field called entity image camera1.photo. Photo is the current representation of what the camera is capturing at that point in time, and what I'm doing is I'm saving that in a field called entity image so that I can reference it later, and we'll see on the next slide how I end up using that. Now this continues from our last example, only what I've done is I've changed, if you tap on the picture itself, that it does the capture of the image to the context like we were talking about. And what I've done is with the button, I now have it using the patch command. Now the patch we briefly talked about in the prior module, but I wanted to show you it again. And what I'm doing in this example is I'm using it to update the entity image, just that single field when the button update is clicked on the record. And like I did in the prior example when we did this, I'm saying patch contacts, which is my record set. I'm passing the record I want to patch, which I'm using first with a filter on contacts, where the contact ID is equal to browsergallery1.selected.contact ID. So it's the record I have selected in the gallery that's on a page that you can't see right now. And what I want to update is the entity image to have a value of entity image. Now that second entity image is coming from my scratch or my context that we saved on the last slide when they tapped on the image. So what I'm doing here is literally just updating that one field on the record. Now, if you've ever used the Dynamics 365 mobile application, this might be a familiar concept to you. It's basically open in Dynamics 365. So in other words, I'm in my nice small Power App that's focused on a particular task. I have a contact or another record in there that has other features that you can do with it in the full Dynamics 365. Rather than re-implementing all that functionality in my Power App, what I could do is have a button on it or an action that the user could perform, which effectively opens in Dynamics 365. Now, the way we do that is we leverage the capability that Dynamics 365 has to be able to navigate to individual records or forms or views specifically. I'm going to open up the contact form. So what I'm doing is I'm using the launch command. So when you click on the web button, it's going to cause the on select event to trigger. In the expression, I've used launch, the URL for the Dynamics 365 organization, and I've passed a series of parameters. ETN equal to contact, that tells it what type of entity. The page type is entity record, and the ID I'm going to set to this item.contact ID because that is the GUID of the contact that I'm working with at this particular point in time. And what that's going to do is open a browser window, navigate me to that specific form, and bring up that record and allow me to take actions from there. Now I wanted to build on the example we had on the prior slide where we basically launched and opened the web page One of the things you may have noticed, and might have made you wonder, how are we going to handle that being in multiple places? But we have a hard-coded URL in there. There's no concept of really application settings within PowerApps that you can store things like that, but you can actually create your own. And I want to walk you through kind of a pattern that you can use to store settings or things that you might want to use throughout the application. So rather than having the URL 10 or 15 times in the application in different places or other values like that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use something called a collection. And you can use collections for storing any type of data, including records that users add or retrieve that you want to save as kind of a working set of records. Here what I'm doing is I'm using it to store some settings that I want to reference later in the application. So one of the things, if I click on the page that shows when my application first launches, one of the events that triggers is on visible. That happens when that form is shown for the first time on application launch. So what I've done there is I've created a collection called settings in order to ensure that it always gets cleared out. Otherwise, especially when you're doing development, it retains some of the old values. What I'm doing first is I'm in the function, I'm specifying clear and then settings, which is the name of my collection. So that gets rid of anything that was in there from a prior run. Mostly it matters during development time. And then I say collect settings, comma, web URL, and then the value. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a record to that collection settings that has a property on it, or field that has the value of web URL that's set to my organization instance. Now, one other thing I want to mention about these two functions that I've just called, notice that in that expression I've called two functions, and the way I've done that is I've strung them together with a semicolon in between them. That allows you to run multiple functions, and it will run them in the order which they appear in the formula window. Now, once I've done this, that collection exists, and as I navigate to other pages and I want to use the value, you'll see at the bottom what I've done is in the launch, instead of hard coding the URL, what I've done is I've said first, parentheses, settings, which says, give me the first record from that collection, and then I want to reference the web URL property. So dynamically on the fly, I'm essentially replacing that with the value that I specified in my settings. Now, if later that URL changes, for example, I go from my sandbox to my production org, I would only have one place in the application that I have to make that change. Now, some fields like full name already combine the first and last name and make it easy, but you may have other things. For example, we want to show a lead with the full name and the title as one field, so we don't take up two hard-coded areas on the form. So what we would do is, by default, we would be referencing in the field, just in the expression, we would have full name. That would cause just the text of that name to be shown on there. So what we can do instead is change that function to full name ampersand, which indicates concatenating, double quote, comma, space, because we want to put a comma space after that, ampersand, this item dot job title. Now, this item is a quick reference to you to the current record that is being processed by the data source. And that allows you, if you're on an item in a gallery or on a form, this item references the current record that it's working with. So in this case, what I'm doing is concatenating the job title. Now, I might make this even a little more fancy. I'm not going to show it on here, but let's say I wanted to not only include the title if there was a value in the title field. What I could do is I could add an if function in there wrapped around checking the job title for containing data, only then concatenate in the comma and the job title into the full name. One of the field types that's popular in Dynamics 365 is option sets, which is essentially a set of label value pairs. So in this example, I've got the preferred contact methods for a contact. And so what happens is in Dynamics 365, I've defined this as with options any, email, phone, fax, and email. Now these all have numeric values associated with them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 correspondingly. And that's what's actually saved on the record when you save a record in Dynamics 365. When you pull the data back in a PowerApps, in other words, when I query contacts, as you can see on the left-hand side, I've got a field under Yvonne's name there and under the image that has the preferred contact method code that is stored for that option set on that record. And you'll notice it's a 1. 1 is not a very friendly way of presenting that field. Now, what we really want to do is display, in this case, any, because that's the value that it is. So the only way we can do this, that doesn't get automatically resolved. we need to resolve that manually on our side. Now, we could do an if statement that basically does a check if it's equal to 1 and put the particular value in there. That would be a little tedious, and especially if you had to multiple places you're referencing it, or maybe you want to have a drop down for editing those values as well, that wouldn't be the best approach to do. One option you have, and this is just another pattern that you could use as an example, similar to what we did for the settings in the onVisible property on the first screen, we could create a collection. In this case, I've called it preferred contact methods, and I've set the values to the same that are in the option set. So any is a value of 1, the label for email, value of 2, and what I do, you can see in the lower right-hand side, is I've changed that text field. Instead of referencing the preferred contact method code, what I do is a lookup on the collection that I've created. I match where the value is equal to the preferred contact method code, and then I populate the label on there. Now what this does is then you can see under Yvonne's name there, I now end up having the any show, and that is how we want to display it in a more user-friendly way. Now let's look at an example of showing related records. This is a common scenario also. For example, I'm looking at accounts. I pick one of the accounts. I want to see all the contacts, the opportunities, the cases. And you can kind of see the data that I have there. And I want to give kind of a full picture across the entities all on one screen. So let's start in the upper left-hand side. For accounts, it's pretty straightforward. My expression is accounts, and that's my data source that I'm using. That actually will pull back all the accounts. I might want to put a filter around that or some other searching, but that's pretty straightforward. We've talked about how to do that. For the contacts, what I've done is I'm basically saying filter contacts on the parent customer ID equal gallery.selected.account ID. Now the nice thing about PowerApps is it will react to this real time. So the list of contacts that I'll show as I click from fourth copy to litware will dynamically adjust, because as that selected value changes on the account ID, it will cause the query to be refiltered again for contacts, opportunities, and cases. Now I've done the same thing for opportunities, where I'm going after the opportunities and then customer ID value, and then same thing for cases. I'm going after the customer ID value and pulling back those records. Now you might also be interested in showing some totals, and I'll give you the good and the bad news about this. First of all, it's very easy to do some counts. There's a count rows function, and so what you can do is say count rows, open parentheses, data source. There's a couple ways you could do this. You could say count rows accounts, which would go after the accounts entity directly. What will happen though is it will actually only bring back the first 500. So if you have under 500, you'll get an accurate count of the accounts that you have, and that will work well. If you have over 500 accounts, you will only get a count of 500 from that query. Now the other thing you could do, what I've done here, is I've said I've got a gallery that has a list of accounts that's showing 10, and I've said count rows gallery accounts dot all items. Now the one thing to keep aware of, same thing here, it's a little bit different than all the records in the system. So if I had 30,000 records in my accounts or my contacts, the count rows on gallery contacts all items would start out with 500, because that's how many are returned in the first batch that comes back from the server. If I scroll down in that gallery and trigger the paging, it'll pull back an additional set of records at a time. And for example, what you'd see is it go from 500 to 600 to 700 to 800 each time it got additional data on there. But in any of these approaches, you're not going to get a true record count. What you're going to most likely get a most accurate record count is the records in the grid that are being displayed at that point in time. So you do have the ability to have that, but just keep in mind that that's what you have available for you. Same thing is true of showing totals. In other words, if I want to get totals for all accounts, what's the opportunity value for all the opportunities that I have? Same thing there. Now this becomes a little bit easier, because oftentimes what you're wanting to look at is particularly like the summary of all the opportunities I have, what's the budget amount for all of them. And so you can see what I'm using here is I'm using a couple of functions that are a little bit new to us. So let's kind of go through them, starting with the function below where I say concatenate. So I'm using this instead of the ampersand. That this is just a function way of being able to do that. So I'm saying opportunity budget is pipeline is, comma, and then I'm concatenating another string is of text. Now that text I'm getting from doing a sum on gallery opportunity all items dot budget amount. So in other words, what I'm doing is I'm summarizing and getting a total of the budget amount of all the gallery opportunity items that are being filtered for that account. So in other words, just the opportunities for that account, I'm summing up the total of all their budget amounts. And then the final parentheses in that sum, or the text I should say, is telling the text function to format to be currency and to suppress only the characters that have numeric values. So 3000, 254, I'm suppressing the dollar signs from that budget amount essentially. You might want to give a little bit of color to your application, and you can do that using themes. If you go to the Home tab, go to the Theme section on there, you'll see a whole set of pre-built color scenarios that you can pick from light blue, coral, red. Blue is the default generally, and you can see the look of that on the left-hand side. By default, your app will be named, guess what? App. And you'll have a background of blue and kind of one of the default icons. And guess what? If anybody builds an application, they're going to have the same thing. So probably you want to come here, give it a more meaningful name and a description. Ultimately, this is what users will see when they are shared the application and see it in their list of applications. So you might want to give it. So here's an example where I've named my application Lead Coach. I've chosen a background color of red. I want this to be a world globally type application, so I found the globe. And I put a description in there. This will help you work with your leads more efficiently. And then you just go ahead and save the settings, and this will be the name that will be used for your application. I want to take a second to talk about a couple of limitations that you might run into. These are more common ones that you may hit. First one is around the modified on as well as the created and modified by. So in other words, who did the action. If you were trying to see, for example, what leads have been changed in the last day or week, there's really not a way to do that because the modified on is not returned as the fields that you can do. And you can't show these fields either right now. They are reviewing that to see if they're able to make those available. Another one that comes up is if you want to have roles only perform certain actions, or you may want to tailor based on role. The user's roles that they have are not exposed to you in the PowerApps. You could, in both of these scenarios, go through a custom API to be able to do that. And also, you're not able to do permission discovery. So you're not able to discover is a user able to delete a record or a user is able to create or modify a record. You have to actually do the action and you'll get an error, and then you're able to detect the error and react from there. So that's just some of the common tasks. We could probably go on for hours with different ones like this, but we had a collection that we wanted to kind of present and get you started with some common tasks that you could work with. The key thing to remember is that a little thinking up front can make your Power App a little bit more maintainable. Things like the application settings and other things like that all go towards making the application more maintainable. You want to look for patterns when you build your applications and go ahead and share those with others in your organizations. As we continue to mature with building Power Apps, it's quite obvious we're going to find some tips and tricks that are helpful. Keep watching for ongoing updates because some of the tasks that we've shown in here, for example, working with option sets, would become easier if they started just returning that label. So you may at some point be able to get rid of some of the workarounds or extra work that you've had to do to accommodate that data not being automatically returned.